Hey students, welcome back. Are you guys ready for chapter 2, part 2? All right, let's do this. So here we got the key terms for this lecture. We're going to begin by talking about Puritans and Pilgrims and the differences between the two. And then we're going to focus primarily on these northeastern settlements, New England settlements as they're often referred to. And so that's this entire lecture is focusing on that. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're going to begin with a map here that's going to show us the colonial progression of English settlement in North America. And as you can see, these little ships here, they're numbered. The first colony that came to North America to settle for the English was the Roanoke colony. This was a colony that established itself off the coast of North Carolina in the 1580s, and it actually disappeared. Very sort of mysteriously, you've got over 100 people who just kind of disappeared. There was no evidence of any kind of fighting or any kind of disease or anything, just gone. And so that happened back in the 1580s. And then you fast forward here to 1607, and you have the establishment of Jamestown here along the James River in this entire Chesapeake region, which we talked about chapter 2, part 1. And then number 3, you have here the founding of Plymouth, which is the first wave of colonists, and then the Massachusetts colony. And you can see here also the native tribes. So here you have the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, right? Around Jamestown, you have the Powhatan tribe. So these are all very early English colonies that are going to be established here along the eastern seaboard. Okay, so we're going to now talk about these two groups of colonists that are going to come to the New England area. Both of these groups are actually considered Puritans. So I want to make that clear before we get started. That can be confusing because these slides make it seem as if Pilgrims and Puritans are two totally separate people. They are all considered Puritans, but within the Puritan groups, there are distinctions, okay? And so I want to make those distinctions so that we can talk about these different groups. They had different ways of governing, and they had different belief systems, okay? So the Pilgrims are the very first group that arrives in Plymouth. This is a group of about 100 people, primarily working class people. They had already been exiled at one point from England to the Netherlands, and then they get kicked out of the Netherlands and they come back to England, and they get a charter by the Queen of England to go ahead and take this trip to the coast of Virginia. So they were actually aiming towards Virginia when they got blown off track and they ended up off the coast of Massachusetts. They traveled in 1620 on the ship the Mayflower, and again they get blown off course and they settle in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So they are the first English settlers to arrive in New England and set up a permanent settlement. The Puritans are going to come later. They're a much larger group, 10 years after the Pilgrims arrive. They will travel and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that happens in 1630. And I'm going to talk more about this later, but this is just an overall introduction. And again, it's kind of nice to have these comparisons so that you can have a sense of these two groups. So they had two different reasons for coming to the shores of America. The Pilgrims came because they wanted to separate from the Anglican Church. So remember the Anglican Church, the Church of England. This is the church that was set up by King Henry VIII because he wanted to divorce his wife. And so The Pilgrims are really looking to have a pure kind of Reformation experience. They wanted to separate from the Anglican Church, and they wanted to start their own church, their own form of religion. The Puritans are a little less radical. They sought to purify the church, so that's what they had in common with the Pilgrims, but they were not separatists. They just wanted to see reform within the Church of England, within the Anglican Church. And they continued to be considered themselves to be part of the official Church of England. Okay, so the earliest Puritan group to immigrate from England, later known as the Pilgrims, espoused a heresy known as separatism. They sought to withdraw from the Church of England. So they were considered really radical Puritans. The Pilgrims had obtained permission to settle in the extensive lands granted to the Virginia Company, landed in present-day Massachusetts in 1620. Now, they landed there because they were blown off course, and they had actually left England in the fall. And when they left, it's not a good idea to try to cross the Atlantic in the fall because you could encounter storms, and they did, and they were blown off course. They were forced to basically settle off the coast of Massachusetts, and they founded the Plymouth Colony. When they got there, and we know this because of William Bradford and his detailed journaling of not just the crossing across the Atlantic, but also what their first impressions of this land was that they were very scared. It was a barren landscape. It was very cold. It appeared to them as if there had been Native Americans living along the shore, but their villages had been abandoned. And so they did quite a remarkable thing. They created a document, a compact called the Mayflower Compact. And basically what it was a promise amongst the people. It was signed by nearly all of the males that were present. And these people came as family units. There were males, females, there were children. In fact, two children were born on the Mayflower as they crossed over the Atlantic. But this Mayflower Compact was a covenant. And basically what they were trying to do was to create this body politic that would be based on equality, that would be based on having a elected government. And they talk about in this particular document, this political document, they talk about having the consent of the government, having the consent of the governed, and having an elected government. So this is a really incredible document, this little Mayflower Compact, and I am going to post a copy of it in your module so that you can read it. It's a really short document, but it's quite remarkable for its time in 1620. And it really is representative of the first type of American document where it mentions things like equality, it mentions things like the consent of the government and elected officials. So they disembark off the ship after they have all signed the Mayflower Compact. They elect William Bradford as their governor, and they go to work setting up this little colony. And they're basically suffering, very similar to the Jamestown people, but for different reasons, mostly because of the weather, because of unfamiliarity with the landscape, the inability to grow anything, not really knowing how to hunt. The Pilgrims were unwilling to eat things like shellfish, which are very abundant in this area. They thought that lobsters were disgusting, and they didn't want to eat them. So anyway, so it won't be though until the following spring that the native people, the Wampanoag Nation that is surrounding this Plymouth colony, will start to reach out to them. over that first winter, about half of those original colonists are going to die, just from starvation, from disease, from exposure because of how cold it gets on the shores of Massachusetts in the winter. It snows there, on the beach in the winter. So in the spring, though, they get this blessing with these two native people, these Wampanoags, that reach out to them, Samoset and Tisquantum. Both Samoset and Tisquantum knew how to speak English, and they had learned this through their various encounters with fishermen and people, Europeans along the coast. So the Wampanoags had seen Europeans before, both Spanish and English, but they had never encountered Europeans that were trying to actually settle on their land. They also had a chief named Massasoit, and Massasoit was friendly to the English. And so it creates this kind of friendship between these original settlers, the Pilgrims, and the Wampanoag Nation. And in fall of 1621, the first Thanksgiving, or what is called the first Thanksgiving, is settled in the Plymouth colony, is celebrated in the Plymouth colony. This was actually not the first Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was a tradition that the Pilgrims already carried with them. And also the native people had their own harvest festivals and things like that. So, and it's interesting because in William Bradford's journal, which later on becomes published as the story of the Plymouth plantation, he writes about this Thanksgiving, but it only is like a few lines in the journal where he talks about how the Indians and the colonists had come together for this big feast. He mentions some of the foods that were there, like the deer and the turkey, the corn and the squash. And he speaks about it in a very thoughtful and positive way, but it's not a big deal, right? So, but anyway, so that's when this first Thanksgiving happens in the fall of 1621, and it really is due to the kindness of the native people that the Pilgrims, these original colonists, were able to survive in the Plymouth colony. Very similar to the Jamestown colony, right, where you have Powhatan and his people who are, being kind, at least initially, to the settlers there, and at least bartering and trading with them for food. The Plymouth colonists had a much more positive relationship with the Wampanoag people, and that will last for some time. Okay, the second group of Puritans to arrive, and we're just going to call them Puritans because these are non-separatists, religious group. They wanted to see the Church of England reformed. They thought that the Church of England remained too much like the Catholic Church. And they are going to arrive on the shores of Massachusetts in 1630, 10 years after the Pilgrims arrived. They also were very much more inclined to have laws based on religious principles. They were very much about reading the Bible, having a certain amount of literacy. They really emphasized literacy so that you could read the Bible, and also listening to sermons, right? So you had these preachers giving these sermons, and they were really critical for sort of understanding the world around you. They are going to end up setting up more of a theocracy. So while the Pilgrims with their Mayflower Compact really talked about this government that was a representative government, that was led by the consent of the governed, for equality and peace for everybody, the Puritans were much more focused on creating this godlike, city upon the hill, which is exactly what the governor of this Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, will talk about. He'll talk about creating a city upon a hill, a God-like society. So even though both of these groups are Puritans, they have different types of government systems and different types of religious beliefs. They will locate their colonies pretty close to each other. Plymouth is more on Cape Cod, and the Puritans, the second wave, they will come and settle in what is now present-day Boston and that area there. So they established this Massachusetts Bay Colony, as I mentioned, in 1630, 10 years after the Pilgrims. They also got a royal charter to create this colony. John Winthrop is going to be the governor of this particular colony, and when they come in large numbers. So when they arrive, they have 11 ships, they have 700 people. Again, similar to the Pilgrims, they are arriving in family units, so you have men and women, children, sailing from Massachusetts. 500 more will arrive after that. And so again, they don't want to separate necessarily from the Church of England. They still consider themselves part of the Church of England, but they consider themselves the pure Church of England, right? This reformist church. And as I mentioned, they are really wanting to base their laws on their religious beliefs. They are very much about these first people that arrive. They think that the first people to arrive in this colony are the ones who are the purists, and this comes into play later on in the lecture. I'm going to refer to these people in the Great Migration. But the first colonists were considered part of this Great Migration, and that was the first 20 years of the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. After the first 20 years, immigration to the Massachusetts Bay Colony actually declines significantly, but population continues to rise because of natural growth, because people are having children. So you can see about 21,000 immigrants came to Massachusetts in these first 20 years. And again, these are people that are considered part of this first wave, this Great Migration. By the time you get to this 1640s, right, just 10 years after the colony is established, New England has one of the highest ratios of preacher to population in all of Christendom, meaning there are a lot of churches. So it really shows you how religion was very important to these original colonists up here in these Puritan colonies. Now, they were coming because they did want to be able to practice religious freedom, but they did not believe in religious toleration, not at all. They believed that their religion was the only religion, and they wanted freedom to practice that one and only religion. So I want to be clear about that. It's not that they wanted everybody to have freedom of religion. In fact, it was quite the opposite. They wanted to be able to be free to create what they call their city upon the hill, right? This God-like community. All right, so here we have a map, and this shows us these areas of New England as they were settled over time. So you can see here, this is the Plymouth colony. This is the original colony founded in 1620. And then you've got some other areas here. You've got Salem in 1626. You've got Boston in 1630. Ipswich in 1633. So you can see how these colonists, eventually spread out, and they're creating these towns throughout this New England area. I also want to point out that Plymouth was originally its own colony. Eventually it will join Massachusetts, but you can see here originally Massachusetts was this area up here, and Plymouth was separate. They eventually will join together. I also want to point out Rhode Island right here and also Connecticut. These are actually areas that were settled by people who were unhappy with some of the belief systems in these original colonies, and so they break away and they create their own colonies in Rhode Island and Connecticut. Rhode Island in particular comes to be known as a place with a lot of religious toleration and a lot of religious diversity. Keep in mind that these original Puritan colonies were not religiously tolerant. They did not want any other type of religion living there. In fact, there were lots of accounts of people like Quakers, for example, and coming to these colonies early on and getting persecuted. I also want to point out New Hampshire up here and also Maine, which was technically part of Massachusetts for a while. So you can see all of these colonies that were spreading out, all originally part of these Puritan waves, but then some of these dissenters, as they were known, break off and create their own belief systems in their own colonies in these other areas. One other thing I want to point out here is the Connecticut River, which runs right here, and the Hudson River, which runs right here. This area right here is where Manhattan is, and this was a Dutch colony at the time. So just so you understand that the Dutch have a presence here, and then of course the French also have a presence here as well. This is going to be really important to understand when we talk about the Pequot War, because all of these different colonial powers, the Dutch, the French, the English, they are competing. And in many ways, the native populations are kind of stuck in the middle. Keep in mind that even though this is reflecting English colonies, there are native populations all throughout this region. Okay, so one of the important things to understand about the Puritans is this belief in predestination. So the Puritans are part of a Calvinist branch of Protestantism. And John Calvin was actually a student of Martin Luther's, and he breaks away from Martin Luther, who was the original, of course, one to start the Protestant Reformation. He breaks away from Martin Luther, and he has sort of a lot more stricter ideas about stricter interpretations of the Bible, but he also believes in this thing called predestination. Now, what is predestination? Predestination is the belief that God has already predetermined which souls will receive eternal life, which souls are going to go to heaven. And there's really nothing that you can do in your life to change that. So you are part of the pre-elected. Now, the Puritans believed that they had figured out a way to determine who these pre-elected individuals are, who these predestined individuals are. And they figured out who these individuals were by having these certain tests that you would have to pass, these certain tests that you would have to pass in the church. And then if you acted in a very godly manner, if you pass all of these tests, then you could become what they called a visible saint. If you were a visible saint, then you were somebody that was a full church member. In Puritan society, this was very important because if you were a full church member, then you would have the right to vote. You would have the right to be in an elected position. So this causes a whole lot of anxiety for a lot of people because everybody wanted to be a visible saint, but not everybody could be a visible saint. And so there was a lot of monitoring of people's behavior in these Puritan communities. There was a lot of self-anxiety where people felt like they might, their souls might be damned, and that created a lot of anxiety. They believed in things like witches and evil spirits, and so they felt like they could be vulnerable to being possessed by those at any time. And certainly, if you were possessed by any of those spirits, there was no possible way that you could be part of this predestined elect group that was already determined to go to heaven at birth. So this causes a lot of, as I mentioned, religious anxiety throughout these Puritan communities. And of course, we're going to talk about the culmination of that in many ways when we talk about the Salem witch trials. So, as I mentioned, the Puritans were very much interested in creating a godly community. And so they basically created laws that reflected their religious beliefs. Officially, their church and state were separate, but they created laws, again, that reflected these Puritan beliefs. So let me give you some examples. They were extremely strict about not doing anything on the Sabbath, on Sunday. Sunday was the Lord's Day. And basically, if it was Sunday, you were expected to be at home with your family, sitting, and the only thing you were essentially allowed to do was to read the Bible. The other thing is that the Puritans did not believe in celebrating any of the Christian celebrations that are very common today, like Christmas, Easter, any kind of religious wedding. They didn't believe in any of that because none of that is actually in the Bible. So they thought, well, if it's not in the Bible, it is blasphemous, to have these celebrations. They also were very strict about having any kind of games, card games, games of dice. Music was restricted unless it was religious music, hymns, or something like that. But music was very restricted. Dancing certainly was looked down upon. So you're talking about a very sort of restricted, very limited society. I mean, talking about no fun, really. And so you see here, these are some, public notices about what is forbidden, Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, fine clothing, all of this is forbidden. If you are caught doing any of these things, you have a fine of 5 shillings, right? And there was also a lot of public shaming in these communities. So you could be put, for example, in a stockade like this and put on public display if you were somebody that violated these laws. And certainly if you violated these laws, right, you definitely were not one of those visible saints. So forget about, becoming a full church member. So here are some more examples of some warnings given out by Puritan communities to not work on the Sabbath. Here you have this example: a woman and her 2 daughters pill and dry flax on the Lord's Day, and they are all burnt. So I don't know if they spontaneously combusted or if God came down and actually, filled them with flames, like, force powers. I'm not sure what happened there. But, you can see how this type of restriction could cause a lot of anxiety. This was certainly a community that was based upon fear and conformity. Okay, so we talked about women in the Chesapeake, and we talked about dower rights and how some women, if they were married and their husband owned land, that they might be, if he died, then and she was left a widow, then she could be allowed to have 1/3 of his property, which was really good for the time period. That was unheard of up in the Puritan communities. Male authority in Puritan communities and in the family was absolute. Women did have the right to become full church members, but they did not have the right to be part of the political group. So you would not be allowed to be part of the general court or any of the elected assemblies. But you could be a full church member. You could, be considered godly. And certainly that was what most, people strove for. They did allow for divorce in Puritan communities if women were being abused, but it was extremely rare, and the women had to petition for it and had to prove that the abuse was happening. They had to have male witnesses to the abuse. So it was very rare that women would actually get divorced in Puritan communities. And if you were divorced, you didn't really want to be divorced if you were a woman because you would be ostracized. People in Puritan communities were expected to be married, men and women alike, but especially women. If you were an unmarried woman, that was considered a threat to the community. Most women's lives, women would get married very young, maybe 15, 16 years old, and your entire life was devoted to your family, to child rearing. The average amount of children that a Puritan woman would have would be 7, but many women had more than that. And women often died in childbirth. So women would, have, 7, 10 children, and then they would die, and then the husbands would remarry, and they would have an additional 7 or 10 children. So it was not uncommon to have these massive, massive families, these big New England families, where, you had, 15, 20 children. That was not uncommon. Okay, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about the government structure in Massachusetts. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony land grants were given by the colony's government. And so people would have these little tracts of land. Typically, the way that the towns were laid out was so that you could see your neighbors. You could kind of see what things your neighbors were doing. There was a real fear of individualism in these communities, as I mentioned. So it was really based on conformity. So you would have the central area where you would have, the church, you would maybe have some shops, you would have a school. Each town had at least one church, sometimes more. After 1647, all towns were required to establish a school. Harvard University was established in 1636. And again, it was founded basically to educate a ministry. So it was meant so that you could, so that they could produce ministers to carry out these sermons at the various churches. In 1638, the first printing press was delivered to the Massachusetts colony, and this allowed for them to, print the Bible primarily, and that was the one reason why they wanted everybody to be literate. In fact, literacy was extremely high in these New England colonies because there was encouragement to read the Bible. The general court, it was the primary structure of the government. It was made up of land-owning church members. So the general court was basically the elite, right? These would be the people who would make up the laws and essentially have the final say in everything. There was some lower bodies, some councils, and some representative councils. So these would have been people who were elected, but they did not have as much power as the general court. The general court was established very early on in the colony in 1634, and then, like I said, it was made up all of these full church members. And all male full church members, I should say. To be a member of the church, you had to be a visible saint. So in order to vote, you also had to be a church member and a visible saint. So people who were not members of the church were considered part of the Bible Commonwealth, but they didn't have access to the same rights that full church members had. So here you have another comparison slide. And so I'm comparing these two groups. So you have the Pilgrims at the Plymouth colony, and they had originally created this Mayflower Compact, right? And they created that when they landed on the shores in 1620. And this compact becomes the foundation of their government. So they believe that everybody in the colony is part of this covenant, and that people who are part of the government are elected to office, and that people should be treated as equals. This is more a model for democracy. So in the Pilgrim Plymouth colony, you have really the beginnings of this democratic representative government that we will see carry over to the American period. Puritans, on the other hand, some of them were elected to office with the exception of the general court, but once they were chosen, they were believed to have divine authority. So this is much more like a theocracy, where you have these religious leaders who are in charge of creating the laws. So on the one hand, you've got the Plymouth colony and the Pilgrims, who are really more of a model for democracy. On the other hand, you've got the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay colony, who's really more of a theocracy, right? Where you have the religious leaders making the laws and the rules. So on the one hand, you've got these elected officials accountable to God, not the people. And then on the other hand, you have elected officials who are accountable to the people. Okay, so now we are going to talk about an event that happens early on in these New England colonial histories in 1637. And this is really the first major, this is notable because it is the first major conflict between these New England colonists and Native people. As I mentioned before, the Wampanoag had good relationships with the Plymouth colony, at least early on. Chief Massasoit was very kind to the colonists, worked with them, traded with them, helped them survive. But in these sort of more remote areas of the colony, as you start to go more inland, and as people start to establish themselves further inland, they're going to encounter other Native American tribes. And the one that they encounter on the edge of the Connecticut River, which I pointed out to you on the map, are the Pequot. And the Pequot are kind of stuck in the middle of some disputes. The Pequot, as they live along the Connecticut River, they are stuck trading with all of these different groups, these different European groups. So you have the Dutch traders, you have the French traders, and you've got the English traders. And so let me talk about a little bit about the fur trade. The fur trade was an extremely lucrative and important commodity trade for these early colonists. The fur, particularly the beaver pelts, were used to make hats, and they were highly desirable, and they were very abundant. The problem was that the Europeans did not really understand or know how to capture the fur like the native people did. So what they would do, the Europeans, is they would go out and they would find these Native American allies, and they would get them to go out and do the trapping for them, and then they would trade for European goods, right? And this causes some problems. So an English fur trader is trying to co-opt a Pequot to work for them. And the Pequots are working for the Dutch at this time. And so it turns into a violent confrontation, and an English fur trader is killed by a Pequot. Okay. Soldiers from Massachusetts, from Connecticut, from Narragansett and Mohegan tribes are going to set out to exact revenge on the Pequot. Now, you might be surprised that the Narragansett and the Mohegan tribes are out to get the Pequot, but keep in mind these competitions between these tribes. So the tribes were actually turned against each other because of these complex relationships between Europeans and Native Americans and other Europeans. So there are soldiers from Massachusetts and Connecticut. They are led by Captain John Mason. And this is actually how we know about this particular incident, because he wrote a history about it. He was from Connecticut. And Captain John Underhill, he was from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then there were, as I mentioned, groups of Narragansett and Mohegans. Now, these Narragansett and Mohegans, before they agreed to go and attack the Pequots with these Massachusetts and Connecticut soldiers, they asked that the women and children be spared in the attack. It was very uncommon for Native people to actually kill women and children in attack, in any kind of warfare. What happened more often was that women and children were abducted, and they were taken captive by the tribe. Sometimes they were held for ransom, sometimes they were actually integrated into the tribes, but they had very strict sort of moral codes against killing women and children. They didn't seem to have much of a problem with killing other men, but they really wanted to ensure that women and children would not be killed. They were ensured of that by the soldiers from Massachusetts and Connecticut. Okay, so they set off and they attacked this Pequot village. Now, the Pequot village, you can actually see it pictured here. This is an artist rendering of it. So this is where the village is. They have erected these big fortifications around their village, and there's only two ways in. And this was not uncommon, right? This was something that happened, and particularly for a tribe where you might have enemy tribes around, they tended to have, build these fortifications. So these Pequots are, hunkered down for the night. It's May 26, 1637, and they surprise attack the Massachusetts and Connecticut and Narragansett Mohegan group, surprise attack this village, this Pequot village. And they come in and they're trying to, basically kill as many people as they can. They're trying to take as much as they can from the Pequots. The Pequots have a storage of furs and things like that. And when they do this, they end up becoming trapped in the village, right? And as a result of that, the captains from Massachusetts and Connecticut make a decision to burn the village down. And when this happens, about 500, at least, we're not sure, but at least 500 Pequots are killed in this attack on this village. And that included women and children, which was very disturbing to the Narragansett and the Mohegans who were present. So this then sets off this 4 months of fighting throughout the summer of 1637. And the end result of it is that most of the Pequot tribe will be killed, or some of them will be sold into slavery, taken down to Barbados and places like that to work on plantations. So there was a lot of reasons why this happened. I mentioned the fur trading dispute, but there was also all of these issues with property and the fact that the English had been encroaching upon Pequot land, that English livestock were beginning to damage Indian crops. That there were disputes with trading, and that oftentimes the English were trading alcohol to the native people, and that was making disputes more heated between the different tribes. There were also smallpox epidemics that were ongoing because of their contact with Europeans. So the Pequot War, as it comes to be known, is this 4-month-long war beginning with this attack on this village where a bunch of innocents are killed that will end with basically the total destruction of the Pequot tribe. So if we look here, we can see the colonies as they begin to develop. So this is a map that's Virginia. Obviously, there's the founding of Jamestown, the first successful English colony. And then up here we have Massachusetts. And that's going to be the Puritans. They're going to found their colony up there after 13 years after the Jamestown colony is established. And then you can see how these are regionally divided up. So the New England colonies are reflected here in this purple color. You go down here, this orange color, you have the what are called middle colonies. We haven't talked about them yet, but we will in subsequent lectures. And then you've got Virginia, which is in this map called the Chesapeake colony, and then you've got the lower southern colonies of the Carolinas and Georgia, which will be established later. Now, really, I like to just kind of divide it into 3 regions where you have the southern regions right here, you have the middle colonies right here, and you have the New England colonies. Each of these areas have a very sort of distinct economic or very distinct economic regions, right? So down here in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, you have the plantation system that is going to emerge. Here in the middle colonies, you're going to have more trade, more commerce, but also you're going to have wheat growing, which is going to become really predominant in these areas of Western Pennsylvania. And then up here, you've got the New England colonies where you've got things like fishing becoming big business, a shipbuilding becoming big business. Certainly timber becomes big. You've got a lot of forests up here, and those forests are being cut down, and that wood is being shipped over to Europe and to England. So those are the 3 big regions. You'll also notice these forts out here. These are forts that are French forts. So you can see how much the French have claimed in these interior regions. You will also notice that these areas down here are claimed by the Spanish. So you've got a lot of competing interests here, and so that eventually is going to lead to some conflict. Always remember the native people, which were the first inhabitants of these lands, and they are now having to deal with the influx of Europeans onto their lands. Okay, and the final thing I want to point out is this steady progression of population growth. So here you have a table which shows us a graph which shows us the population growth beginning in 1610 and then ending in 1700. So you see here that the total population is a little bit over in the colonies, a little bit over 250,000 by the time you get to 1700. So it is a steady growth. You can see that some areas are growing quicker than others. You see that the southern colonies are growing pretty steadily, and there are a lot of there's a lot of growth there. The middle colonies are still growing, but not quite as much. And then the New England colonies also growing, and a lot of that due to natural growth, meaning people having babies. All right, well, that's it for now. So we are ending at 1700. So we are going to begin to talk about the 1700s in our next lectures in chapter 3. And I will see you then. Bye.